Introduction and History. Cognitive psychology is the study of human thought. It asks questions regarding how we might understand information that is presented to our senses. What can we learn from our external world from our sensory information? How is sensory information processed and interpreted to generate or moderate our behaviour? Does studying the brain help us understand the human mind? And is there something more than just information processing that creates our human experience? These questions about human thought can quickly become philosophical. Nevertheless, we will try to explain these questions throughout the unit. Key terms: cognition. Cognition refers to the way our brains process information. It includes mental processes such as attention, learning, understanding language, problem solving, and decision making. Cognitive psychology. This is the branch of psychology involved with attempting to understand human cognition by experimental methods based on information processing models. Cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience has become possible because of recent advances in technologies that have dramatically increased our understanding of brain function. Cognitive neuroscience allows us to make direct connections between cognitive processes and the structural components of the brain. History. Cognitive psychology has its origins in ancient Western philosophy. Great philosophers attempted to comprehend how humans understood and interact with their environment. Many of the questions they asked throughout their lifetime still remain unresolved today. You will learn more about the history and philosophy of psychology in this unit. Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920. Wilhelm was a German philosopher and physician known as the father of experimental psychology. He founded the first psychology lab in 1879, which focuses on the scientific study of the mind. You paved the way for psychology to be considered a science by advocating that the laws of the mind can be found in the same rigorous scientific ways as the laws of chemistry and physics. Now on to the unit reading. Approaches to human cognition. Introduction. We are now well into the third millennium, and there is more interest than ever in unravelling the mysteries of the human brain and mind. This interest is reflected in the substantial upsurge of scientific research within cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. It is striking that the cognitive approach has become increasingly important within clinical psychology. In that area, it is recognised that cognitive processes, especially cognitive biases, play an important role in the development and successful treatment of mental disorders. In similar fashion, social psychologists increasingly assume that cognitive processes help to explain much of social communication. What is cognitive psychology? It is concerned with the internal processes involved in making sense of the environment and deciding what action might be appropriate. These processes include attention, perception, learning, memory, language, problem solving, reasoning, and thinking. We can define cognitive psychology as aiming to understand human cognition by observing the behaviour of people performing various cognitive tasks. Note, however, that the term cognitive psychology can be used more broadly to include brain activity and structure as relevant information for understanding human cognition. It is in this broader sense that it is used in the title of this book. The aims of cognitive neuroscientists overlap with those of cognitive psychologists. However, there is one important difference between cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology in the narrow sense. Cognitive neuroscientists argue convincingly we need to study the brain as well as behaviour while people engage in cognitive tasks. After all, the internal process involved in human cognition occur in the brain. We can define cognitive neuroscience as using information about behaviour and the brain to understand human cognition. Thus, the distinction between cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology in the broader sense is blurred. Cognitive neuroscientists explore human cognition in several ways. First, there are brain imaging techniques of which functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is fMRI, is probably the best known. Second, there are electrophysiological techniques involving the recording of electrical signals generated by the brain. Third, many cognitive neuroscientists study the effects of brain damage on human cognition. It is assumed that patterns of cognition impairment shown by brain-damaged patients can inform us about normal cognitive functioning and the brain areas responsible for various cognitive processes. The huge increase in scientific interest in the workings of the brain is mirrored in the popular media. Numerous books, films, and television programs have communicated the more accessible and dramatic aspects of cognitive neuroscience. Increasingly, media coverage includes coloured pictures of the brain indicating the areas most activated when people perform various tasks. Key term: cognitive psychology, an approach that aims to understand human cognition by the study of behaviour. A broader definition also includes the study of brain activity and structure. Another key term: cognitive neuroscience, which is an approach that aims to understand human cognition by combining information from behaviour and the brain. 4 main approaches. There are 4 main approaches to human cognition. Bear in mind, however, that researchers increasingly combine 2 or even more of these approaches. We will shortly discuss each approach in turn, and you will probably find it useful to refer back to this chapter when reading other chapters. The 4 approaches are: 1. Cognitive psychology. This approach involves trying to understand human cognition by using behavioural evidence. Since behavioural data are also of great importance within cognitive neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology, cognitive psychology's influence is enormous. 2. Cognitive neuropsychology. This approach involves studying brain-damaged patients to understand normal human cognition. It was originally closely linked to cognitive psychology, but has recently also become linked to cognitive neuroscience. 3. Cognitive neuroscience. This approach involves using evidence from behaviour and the brain to understand human cognition. 4. Computational cognitive science. This approach involves developing computational models to further our understanding of human cognition. Such models increasingly take account of our knowledge of the behaviour and the brain. Going further into the first approach of human cognition, cognitive psychology. It is almost as pointless to ask, when did cognitive psychology start, as to inquire, how long is a piece of string? However, the year 1956 was of crucial importance. At a meeting at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Noam Chomsky gave a paper on his theory of language. George Miller discussed the magic number 7 in short-term memory, and Newell and Simon discussed their extremely influential model called the general problem solver. In addition, there was the first systematic attempt to study concept formation from a cognitive perspective. At one time, most cognitive psychologists subscribed to the information processing approach, based loosely on an analogy between the mind and the computer. A version of this approach, popular in the 1970s, is shown in Figure 1.1. A stimulus, in brackets, an environmental event such as a problem or a task, is presented. This causes certain internal cognitive processes to occur, and these processes finally produce the desired response or answer. Processing directly affected by the stimulus input is often described as bottom-up processing. It was typically assumed that only one process occurs at any moment in time. This is serial processing, meaning the current process is completed before the next one starts. The above approach is drastically oversimplified. Task processing typically also involves top-down processing. Top-down processing is processing influenced by the individual's expectations and knowledge rather than simply by the stimulus itself. Have you ever seen the image of a triangle with a phrase in it and the word "the" is repeated but we don't see it the first time? So for instance, this one has Paris, then the next line is "in the," and then the next line, "the spring," but we will read it as Paris in the spring. The expectation that it was a well-known phrase, i.e. top-down processing, dominated the information available from the stimulus, i.e. bottom-up processing. The traditional approach was also oversimplified in assuming processing is typically serial. In fact, more than one process typically occurs at the same time. This is parallel processing. We are much more likely to use parallel processing when performing a highly practiced task than a new one. For example, someone taking their first driving lesson finds it almost impossible to change gear, steer accurately, and pay attention to other road users at the same time. In contrast, an experienced driver finds it easy. For many years, nearly all research on human cognition consisted of experiments on healthy individuals under laboratory conditions. Such experiments are tightly controlled and scientific. Researchers have shown great ingenuity in designing experiments to reveal the processes involved in attention, perception, learning, memory, reasoning, and so on. This research has had a major and ongoing influence on the studies conducted by cognitive neuroscientists. Indeed, nearly all the research discussed in this book owes much to the cognitive psychological approach. I'll go over four of those key terms. Bottom-up processing that is directly influenced by environmental stimuli. Serial processing in which one process is completed before the next one starts. Parallel processing in which two or more cognitive processes occur at the same time. And top-down processing, stimulus processing that is influenced by factors such as the individual's past experience and expectations. So top-down processing is using knowledge we already have, where we make an assumption. Bottom-up processing is usually when we don't know anything and we start from the beginning and build onto that. Task processes. An important issue for cognitive psychologists is the task impurity problem. Most cognitive tasks require a complex mixture of processes, thus making it hard to interpret the findings. This issue has been addressed in various ways. For example, suppose we are interested in the process involved when a task requires deliberately inhibiting a dominant response. Miyake studied 3 such tasks: the Stroop task, the anti-saccade task, or it's SACCADE, and the stop signal task. On the Stroop task, participants name the colour in which colour words are presented, example, red printed in green, and avoid saying the colour word, which is hard to inhibit. On the anti-saccade task, a visual cue is presented. The task involves not looking at the cue, but rather inhibiting that response and looking in the opposite direction. On the stop signal task, participants categorise words as rapidly as possible, but must inhibit their response when a tone sounds. Miyake found all 3 tasks involved similar processes. They used complex statistical techniques to extract what was common to 3 tasks. This was assumed to represent a relatively pure measurement of the inhibitory process. Cognitive psychologists have developed several ways of understanding the processes involved in complex tasks. Here we will briefly consider one example. Participants are presented with 5 words visually and repeat them back. Performance is worse when the words are long than when they are short. This probably occurs because participants engage in verbal rehearsal, saying the words to themselves, during word presentation, and this takes longer with long words than with short ones. However, see Chapter 6 for an alternative account. How could we show verbal rehearsal is a process used on this task? Badley and others used articulatory suppression. Participants repeated the digits 1 to 8 in order during presentation of the word list to prevent them rehearsing. As predicted, performance was worse when articulatory suppression was used. In addition, the effect of word length disappeared, thus suggesting its existence depended on verbal rehearsal. Much of this book is devoted to the ingenious strategies cognitive psychologists have used to uncover the processes involved in numerous tasks. Cognitive psychology was for many years the engine room of progress in understanding human cognition, and all the other approaches listed above have derived substantial benefit from it. For example, cognitive neuropsychology became important 25 years after cognitive psychology. It was only when cognitive psychologists had developed reasonable accounts of healthy human cognition that the performance of brain-damaged patients could be understood fully. Before that, it was hard to decide which patterns of cognition impairment were of theoretical importance. In similar fashion, the computational modelling activities of computational cognitive scientists are typically heavily influenced by pre-computational psychological theories. Finally, the great majority of theories driving research in cognitive neuroscience had their origins within cognitive psychology. Indeed, Kohlhart claimed controversially that cognitive neuroscience has so far made no difference to cognitive theorizing. Cognitive psychology has not only had a massive influence on theorizing across all four major approaches to human cognition, it has also had a predominant influence on the development of cognitive tasks and on task analysis, working out how a task is accomplished. However, we must not de-emphasise the substantial contributions of the three other major approaches discussed in detail later. Limitations. In spite of cognitive psychology's enormous contributions, it has various limitations. First, people's behaviour in the laboratory may differ from that in everyday life. The concern is that laboratory research lacks ecological validity, the extent to which laboratory findings are applicable to everyday life. In most laboratory research, the sequence of stimuli presented to participants is based on the experimenter's predetermined plan and is uninfluenced by their behaviour. Wachtel, 1973, called this the implacable experimenter. In everyday life, in contrast, our cognitive processing often involves deciding how to change the current situation to suit ourselves. Second, cognitive psychologists typically obtain measures of the speed and accuracy of task performance. These measures provide only indirect evidence about internal cognitive processes. For example, it is hard on the basis of such measures to decide whether the processes used on a complex task occur serially or in parallel. Third, cognitive psychologists have often put forward theories expressed only in verbal terms, although this is becoming less common. Such theories tend to be vague, making it hard to know precisely what predictions follow from them. Thankfully, this limitation can largely be overcome by computational cognitive scientists developing cognitive models specifying precisely any given theory's assumptions. Fourth, the findings obtained from any given experimental task or paradigm are sometimes specific to that paradigm and do not generalise to other, apparently similar tasks. This is paradigm specificity. It means some findings in cognitive psychology are narrow in scope and applicability. More generally, once an experimental paradigm has been introduced, it turns from a tool of research to a target of research. The way to minimise the problems of paradigm specificity is by developing theories accounting for performance across several similar tasks or paradigms. Fifth, what has been lacking within cognitive psychology is a comprehensive theoretical architecture or framework that would clarify the interrelationships among components of the cognitive system. However, some progress has been made here. The adaptive control of thought rationale, ACT-R model, discussed later in the chapter, is an example of a cognitive architecture. And the key terms here were ecological validity, which is the applicability or otherwise of the findings of laboratory studies to everyday settings, and implacable experimenter, and that is the situation in experimental research in which the experimenter's behaviour is uninfluenced by the participants' behaviour. So that's showing that it's not natural circumstances. So the implacable experimenter doesn't react to any of the participants' responses or anything, which is not natural, and therefore the next reaction might be different to as where it would be in normal environmental circumstances. Same as ecological validity, being always laboratory studies to everyday settings, it's much different. And this key term, paradigm specificity, this occurs when the findings with a given experimental task or paradigm are not obtained, even when apparently very similar tasks or paradigms are used. Cognitive neuropsychology. Cognitive neuropsychology is concerned with the patterns of cognitive performance, intact and impaired, shown by brain-damaged patients. These patients have suffered lesions, structural damage to the brain caused by injury or disease. According to cognitive neuropsychologists, the study of brain-damaged patients can tell us much about normal human cognition. The above idea does not sound very promising, does it? In fact, however, cognitive neuropsychology has contributed a substantial amount to our understanding of normal human cognition. The above idea does not sound very promising, does it? In fact, however, cognitive neuropsychology has contributed a substantial amount to our understanding of normal human cognition. For example, in the 1960s, nearly all memory researchers thought the storage of information in long-term memory depended on previous processing in short-term memory. However, Chalice and Warrington reported the case of a brain-damaged man, KF. His short-term memory was severely impaired, but his long-term memory was intact. These findings played an important role in changing theories of normal human memory. Since cognitive neuropsychologists study brain-damaged patients, it would be easy to imagine they are interested in the workings of the brain. In fact, the leading cognitive neuropsychologist Max Coltheart and many other cognitive neuropsychologists pay little attention to the brain itself. In the words of Coltheart, the principal aim of cognitive neuropsychology is not to learn about the brain. Its principal aim is instead to learn about the mind, that is, to elucidate the functional architecture of cognition. Other cognitive neuropsychologists disagree with Coltheart. An increasing number take account of the brain using techniques such as magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, to identify the brain areas damaged in any given patient. In addition, there is an increasing willingness to consider neuroimaging findings. Theoretical assumptions. The main assumptions of cognitive neuropsychology have been discussed often over the years. Here we will focus on Coltheart's very clear account. One key assumption is modularity, meaning the cognitive system consists of numerous modules or processes operating fairly independently or separately of each other. It is assumed these modules exhibit domain specificity. They only respond to only one given class of stimuli. For example, there may be a face recognition module that responds only when a face is presented. Is the modularity assumption correct? This issue is very controversial. Probably the majority position is that the human cognitive system exhibits some modularity, but cognitive neuropsychologists often exaggerate its importance. This complex issue is discussed in more detail below. The second major assumption of cognitive neuropsychology is that of anatomical modularity. According to this assumption, each module is located in a specific brain area. Why is this assumption important? Cognitive neuropsychologists are most likely to make progress when studying patients with brain damage limited to a single module. Such patients may not exist if there is no anatomical modularity. Suppose all modules were distributed across large areas of the brain. If so, the great majority of brain-damaged patients would suffer damage to most modules. As a result, it would be impossible to work out the number and nature of modules they possessed. Before I go on, I'll go over those key terms. So the first one was modularity, which is the assumption that the cognitive system consists of many fairly independent or separate modules or processes, each specialised for a given type of processing. And the other one is domain specificity, which is the notion that a given module responds selectively to certain types of stimuli, for example faces, but not others. There is evidence of some anatomical modularity in the visual processing system. However, there is much less support for anatomical modularity with most complex tasks. For example, Duncan and Owen found the same areas within the frontal lobes were activated when very different complex tasks were performed. The findings of Yarkoni and others are also relevant. Across more than 3,000 studies, brain areas such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex were activated in 20% of them in spite of the huge diversity of tasks involved. The third major assumption is what Coltheart called uniformity of functional architecture across people. This assumption is important, as can be seen if we consider the consequences if it is false. In that case, we would not be able to use the findings from individual patients to draw conclusions about other people's functional architecture. Related ideas are also common within cognitive neuroscience. For example, it has often been claimed that face processing, in virtually everyone, depends heavily on the fusiform face area. If there are large individual differences in functional architecture and the brain areas involved in any given cognitive process, this greatly complicates the task of understanding human cognition. The fourth assumption is subtractivity. The basic idea is that brain damage impairs one or more processing modules but does not change or add anything. Why is this assumption important? Suppose it is incorrect and patients develop new modules to compensate for cognitive impairments caused by brain damage. That would greatly complicate the task of learning much about the intact cognitive systems by studying brain damaged patients. The subtractivity assumption is sometimes incorrect. There is often partial recovery of the cognitive processes impaired by brain damage. This recovery of cognitive processes can involve recovery of function within the damaged area or the recruitment of different brain regions. Modularity assumption. Modular systems typically involve mostly serial processing, in which processing within one module is completed before processing in the next module starts. As a result, there is very limited interaction among modules. There is some support for modularity from the evolutionary approach. Species with larger brains tend to have more specialised brain regions that could be involved in modular processing. The notion that human cognition is heavily modular is rather difficult to reconcile with neuroimaging and other evidence based on brain activity. The human brain possesses a moderately high level of connectivity. This suggests there is more parallel processing than assumed by most cognitive neuropsychologists. Research in cognitive neuropsychology. How do cognitive neuropsychologists set out about understanding the cognitive system? Of major importance is the search for dissociations, which occur when a patient performs normally on one task, task X, but is impaired on a second one, task Y. For example, amnesic patients perform almost normally on short-term memory tasks, but are greatly impaired on many long-term memory tasks. It is tempting, but dangerous, to use such findings to argue that the two tasks involve different processing modules and that the module or modules needed on long-term memory tasks have been damaged by brain injury. Why do we need to avoid drawing sweeping conclusions from dissociations? A patient may perform well on one task but poorly on a second one simply because the second task is more complex. Thus, dissociations may reflect task differences in complexity rather than the use of different modules. Cognitive neuropsychologists argue that the solution to the above problem is to find double dissociations. A double dissociation between two tasks, X and Y, is shown when one patient performs normally on task X and at an impaired level on task Y, whereas another patient shows the opposite pattern. If a double dissociation is found, we cannot explain the findings away as occurring because one task is harder. For example, we have just seen that amnesic patients have impaired long-term memory but intact short-term memory. Earlier, we saw that other brain-damaged patients, example KF, studied by Chalice and Warrington, have impaired short-term memory but intact long-term memory. The double dissociation involved here strongly suggests that there is an important distinction between short-term and long-term memory and that they involve different brain regions. The approach based on double dissociations has limitations. First, it is based on the assumption that separate modules exist, which may be misguided. Second, double dissociations can generally be explained in various ways and so provide indirect evidence for separate modules underlying each task. Third, it is hard to decide which of the numerous double dissociations in the literature are theoretically important. Finally, we consider associations. An association occurs when a patient is impaired on tasks X and Y. Associations are sometimes taken as evidence for a syndrome. A syndrome is sets of symptoms or impairments often found together. However, there is a serious flaw with the syndrome-based approach. An association may be found between tasks X and Y because the mechanisms on which they depend are adjacent in the brain rather than because they depend on the same underlying mechanism. Gerstmann's syndrome is an example. It is defined by 4 very different symptoms: problems of finger identification, problems in calculation, impaired spelling, and left-right disorientation. It is improbable that the same mechanisms or modules are involved in all 4 tasks. What is much more likely than these 4 symptoms depend on different mechanisms that happen to be anatomically adjacent in the brain. And the key terms there were dissociation, which is dissociation as applied to brain-damaged patients, intact performance on one task but severely impaired performance on a different task. And then double dissociation, the finding that some brain-damaged individuals have intact performance on one task but poor performance on another task, whereas other individuals exhibit the opposite pattern. And also association, which is the finding that certain symptoms or performance impairments are consistently found together in numerous brain-damaged patients. Oh, and syndrome, the notion that symptoms that often co-occur have a common origin. Single case studies versus case series. For much of the history of cognitive neuropsychology, there was a strong emphasis on single case studies. There were 2 main reasons. First, researchers can often gain access to only one patient having a given pattern of cognitive impairment. Second, it is often assumed every patient is unique because no 2 patients have precisely the same pattern of brain damage. It was concluded it would be misleading and uninformative to average the performance of several patients even though they allegedly had the same disorder. You may be surprised to discover that so much research in cognitive neuropsychology has involved individuals. After all, the general recommendation in most psychological research is to use reasonably large samples so we can have confidence in the findings. Within cognitive neuropsychology, there is a movement towards the case series study. Several patients thought to have similar cognitive impairments are tested, and then the data of individual patients are compared and variation across patients assessed. There are several reasons why the case series approach is generally preferable to the single case approach. First, it provides much richer data. Using the case series approach, we can actually assess the extent of variation among patients rather than simply being concerned about it, as in the single case approach. And second, we can develop theories based on most patients within a case series, de-emphasising patients who are outliers. In contrast, with the single case approach, we do not know whether the one and only patient is representative of patients with that condition or is an outlier. The key term there was case series study, which is a study in which several patients with similar cognitive impairments are tested. This allows consideration of individual data and of variation across individuals. Strengths. Cognitive neuropsychology has made numerous major contributions to our understanding of human cognition. Here we will briefly consider its strengths. First, it has played a major role in informing theories of language. For example, consider patients reading visually presented regular words, words whose pronunciation is predictable from the pattern of letters, irregular words, words whose pronunciation is not predictable from the pattern of letters, and non-words aloud. We might imagine that patients with damage to language areas would have problems in reading all words and non-words. In fact, that is not the case. Some patients perform reasonably well when reading regular words or non-words, but poorly when reading irregular words. Other patients can read regular words but have problems with unfamiliar words and non-words. These fascinating patterns of impairment have transformed theories of reading. Second, findings from brain-damaged patients have often had a substantial impact on memory theories. Perhaps the clearest example is HM, now known to be Henry Molaison. He was an amnesic patient whose long-term memory was severely impaired, except his ability to learn motor skills, whereas his short-term memory was intact. These findings provided striking support for 3 hypotheses. First, there is a major distinction between short-term and long-term memory. Second, long-term memory is divided into at least 2 different systems. Third, HM had suffered severe damage to the hippocampus, and so the research identified this area as of crucial importance in long-term memory. The limitations. What are the limitations of the cognitive neuropsychological approach? First, the crucial assumption that the cognitive system is fundamentally modular is reasonable but seems too strong. Modular systems tend to be relatively inflexible and based on serial processing. In contrast, human cognitive processing is noted for its flexibility and extensive interactions throughout the brain. If the modularity assumption is mistaken, this has implications for the whole enterprise of cognitive neuropsychology. Second, other major theoretical assumptions also seem too extreme. For example, neuroimaging research provides only modest support for the assumption of anatomical modularity. In addition, there is little or no convincing evidence supporting the assumption of uniformity of functional architecture. Third, it is assumed that cognitive performance of patients provides fairly direct evidence concerning the impact of brain damage on previously intact cognitive systems. However, some of the impact of brain damage may be camouflaged because patients develop compensatory strategies as they recover. For example, patients with pure alexia, a condition involving severe reading problems, read words by the compensatory strategy of identifying each letter separately. There are also complications resulting from changes in brain functioning during the recovery process. In other words, many patients exhibit considerable neural plasticity following brain damage. Fourth, cognitive neuropsychologists have historically shown relatively little interest in the details of brain functioning and cognitive neuroscience. This seems paradoxical since their focus is on brain-damaged patients. However, findings from cognitive neuroscience are increasingly being combined fruitfully with those from cognitive neuropsychology. For example, this has been done with respect to recognition memory, discussed later. And fifth, there has been too much emphasis on single case studies. Some single case studies, example the famous amnesic patient HM, have deservedly had a huge impact. However, there are real limitations with single case studies, and the case study approach provides a richer source of data.